In the introduction to India's foreign policy, once again, I would like to discuss another very interesting topic, that is the concept of Cold War and the end of the Cold War. So, I am just going to deal with Cold War and the end of Cold War. In fact, I am sure all of you might have heard a lot about this Cold War, but sometimes you may be slightly confused also what is it. If you have to specifically write something about Cold War, how to write and how to you say that it has ended and what was the process or which finally ended this Cold War. So, I would like to discuss that particular aspect of Cold War and the end of the Cold War. Very interesting, and it is we use it so regularly. That is why I want to make some clarity and some specific understanding and knowledge about this. Now, coming to this Cold War, what is Cold War in the first place? What is the definition, or what is it ultimately? It is the open yet restricted rivalry developed after the Second World War. It is an open but restricted rivalry opened after the end of the Second World War, after Second World War, between the US and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. So, basically two players, US and USSR and their respective allies. In fact, Cold War was waged on political, economic and propaganda. I mean, three fronts in which they fought. So, they fought on the political front, they fought on the economic front as well as on the propaganda front. So, on political front, on economic front and propaganda front they fought, but there is less of direct use of any weapon. Hardly any weapon was used. Of course, they deployed the weapons, but they did not use it. So, very limited use of weapons, we can say. Direct fighting was not there. And in fact, this term Cold War was first used by the English writer George Orwell in 1945 itself. George Orwell, English writer, famous English writer, he used the term in 1945 itself. In fact, by 1948, Soviet Union managed to, by 1948, so immediately after the end of the Second World War, by 1948, Soviet Union managed to install left-wing or Soviet-supported governments in Eastern Europe, Soviet-supported or in the Eastern Europe governments. They could manage to establish Soviet-supported government, left-wing governments in Eastern Europe, and it further solidified when the US came out with the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was a plan for reviving the Western European countries, the allies of the US. They came with a massive economic support, which is known as the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan, MARSHALL, Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was introduced by the West and the US to support the West European countries to come out of the war-ravaged Western European countries. So, the US started supporting the West European countries, the Soviet Union started supporting the East European countries, and then the Cold War, it continued. So, and NATO was created in 1949. 1949, NATO was created. The Soviet Union also conducted its nuclear test. 1949 again, nuclear test by USSR. So, things started hot, becoming really hot. And NATO 1949, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Then Soviet supported North Korea attacked South Korea in 1950. North Korea in 1950 attacked South Korea, and this was the beginning of the Korean War. It finally, it did not end it went on till 1953. The war, even today, technically North Korea and South Korea are still in war. They have only signed an armistice. Armistice is one step short of ceasefire. So, they have not, technically they are still on war with North Korea and South Korea, even though the main conflict, or rather the bloody conflict ended in 1953, they are technically on war. Then Warsaw Pact by Soviet Union for the East European countries, Warsaw Pact in 1955. Warsaw Pact was formed in 1955. Then West Germany was admitted to NATO in 1955. West Germany was admitted to NATO in 1955. Then I will say the peak of the Cold War, or rather the high point where the world almost slipped into a third world war, that was during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, when Soviet Union tried to secretly smuggle some of the weapons to Cuba, missiles to Cuba, which can attack the US mainland. So, that is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Finally, that was of course diffused because of the negotiations and the alert rest of the world put a lot of pressure, and it helped in diffusing the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And I will say 1962 was the peak of the Cold War, but it continued in 1960s. Finally, in 1980s, things started diffusing once Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Soviet Union in 1985. And Gorbachev dismantled the totalitarian aspects of the Soviet system. See, there is a totalitarian government. It is a iron curtain. No information outside. The police state. The Soviet Union was a police state, a totalitarian government, authoritarian government, and full control by the state. So Mikhail Gorbachev started relaxing a bit, and he, in fact, what he did is he initiated dramatic new agreements with US in relaxing the what you call the various he initiated various weapon treaties, negotiation with the US, and slowly the Cold War started diluting, or rather the intensity of the animosity between the two countries started diluting. And finally, in fact, Mikhail Gorbachev came up with this concept of glasnost. Glasnost, that means openness, and perestroika. See, these were the two different terms, the Russian terms, which are always in news during that time in 1980s, glasnost and perestroika, the openness and reforms, which the Mikhail Gorbachev initiated, ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the Cold War ended. The ideological war, the war between the Western countries and the East, the war between the capitalists and the communists, finally it was a Cold War, ended in 1991. The ideological war. Cold War was an ideological war, we can say, war between two forms of economic model. So it was political, it was economic, it was a propaganda war. Who is better? They wanted to expand. And the Western world, the US-led world, the NATO alliance, they believed in capitalism, free market economy. Whereas Soviet Union believed in socialism and communism and state-controlled aspects. And which is better? That was the debate. And finally, the Soviet Union could not withstand the pressure. They could not match with the capitalistic world's money power and muscle power and the technology, whatever it is, and ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed and this ideological war ended. So that is the end of the Cold War. So Cold War started after the Second World War, the ideological war, and finally ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's about Cold War. A nice, little interesting topic. So have clarity on how things evolved and finally reached. That's all about Cold War.